everyone, my name is Chen Teng. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to present my final year research writing with the title of Selected Works in Response to Malaysia Policies from the period of 1990 to 2020. This research will be based on the research scope of Vision 2020 and One Malaysia as background to examine the responses in the works of Malaysian artists towards Malaysia policies. I'll briefly explain how these policies are relevant to discuss with art in the context of Malaysia contemporary art development. Since Malaysia's independence, Malaysia has been confronted with multiracial social problems, leading to the need for policies to be carried out in a multicultural manner. According to Vision 2020 proposed by the Malaysian government in the 1991 and One Malaysia declared in 2009 respectively, it strives to build Malaysia as a fully developed and united country. However, Malaysia in the year 2020 does not have the same view as Vision 2020 proposed in 1991. Relationships between Malaysians still remain unstable, and these issues are often compounded by religious complications, social traits, social coordinations, Malaysian politics, and policy. These very issues are all closely interwoven to one another. In order for the country to prosper, mutual acceptance and tolerance among all ethnic groups in improving the quality of the people are the utmost foundations for promoting unity. Despite having beneficial policy, this research suggests that through the views of artists, responses in the works based on these two policies, the impact of both policies on arts will be identified to understand how these two policies drive the country to influence the development of Malaysia's contemporary art. This research will use the conceptual framework to set up the objectives, which are to identify and discuss how the development of multiculturalism in relation to Malaysia's policy, art, culture, and society, and also to identify and analyze how Vision 2020 and One Malaysia have influenced Malaysian artists' works. With the approach of Malaysian study, this research will fall into the new art history, as this research is not only studied under the historical and stylistic background, it also explores the influence of other disciplines and traditions on art history and relates art historical ideals and values to social change, such as social political concept on a discipline infamous for its conservative taste in arts and orthodoxy in research. Therefore, this conceptual frame will be the perspective to study the relation between Malaysia's policy and its arts. Besides that, this research will be based on secondary data as a data source to analyze and discuss the works. The secondary source of data obtained in this research was mainly accumulated through online journals, articles, newspapers, e-books, and e-catalogs. My research gap is basically about the theoretical gap in the prior research concerning of Malaysia art. The theory of Malaysia art is rather dated and the current studies bear the fruit of the theoretical gap. Although some of the prior theory appear to be important, but an investigation in terms of Malaysia's policy responses is also important because it enables Malaysians to understand the impact of Malaysia's policy towards the arts, and at the same time, how artists understand their works can be interpreted in multiple aspects through critical works. The previous theory tends to focus primarily on the identity and history of Malaysia art. It does not encompass new paradigms in arts in response to Malaysia's policies. In Chapter 2, I further discuss Malaysia background and how Vision 2020 and One Malaysia can be seen as multiculturalism as promoted, and the process of such policy in relation to Malaysia arts, culture, and society. In the context of history background, Malaysia was experienced the shift from mono-society to a multicultural society. Before colonization, Malaya was governed by Raja or Sultan. During colonization, Chinese and Indian immigration was common due to labor contracts. Malaya then formed a plural society as according to Furnival, each group has their own religion, culture, language, their own ideas and ways, as people that will only meet within the marketplace. During the period of decolonization, the British created a hybrid society in Malaysia which led to various problems in political, economic, cultural and psychological issues during the path for its independence. First, the British divided the ethnic groups to become a pluralistic society without common consciousness and recognized the special positions of Malays. Secondly, the British did not prepare proper political direction for Malaysia's independence. Malayan Communist Party, with majority of Chinese, then fought against colonial rule and was then lost due to the independence of Malaya. Then, I discussed the development of multiculturalism in Malaysia was indirectly started with the declarations of Rugu Negara, that it aims to form harmony and unity among the various races in Malaysia. This aim has been continued by Vision 2020 and One Malaysia as both policy promoted Bangsa Malaysia, the Malaysian nationhood. To define what is multiculturalism, I use the definition from scholar Kim Lika that multiculturalism is the legal and political acceptance of any diversity, justified as mechanism for replacing earlier patterns of ethnic and racial hierarchies with new relations of democratic citizenship, while for Peter, the term multicultural refers to a factual state or cultural diversity. As multiculturalism is about acknowledging identity in its own term, it therefore triggers the issues of identity concerned in the people, especially the non-Malay who are born in Malaysia. In both Policy Vision 2020 and One Malaysia, multiculturalism does not really show and explain in terms of any national identity. An example such a method is the presence of the term race in the birth certificate for Malaysians to fill instead of the term Bangsa Malaysia that can replace racial distinction. Therefore, ethnic groups are still confused about their own identity. Prior to 1969, Malaysia was largely absent of policy in the field of art and culture. It was until 1971, after the riots, National Cultural Policy was formed and influenced a number of artists to realize a new nationalism. However, during the early 1980s, Malaysia's rapid industrialization and urbanization, neo-regionalism formed in Malaysia art, and it was a symbol of early multiculturalism response in art. The most obvious works of art that responded to multiculturalism during neo-regionalist era can be seen in the Malaysian series by artist Reza Piatasa. After the 1990s, the postmodernist approach have become increasingly involved in the local art scene, thus introducing a more reflexive and confrontational model of creativity aimed at solving political and social problems, which gravitated to a response towards policies. In Chapter 3, I further discuss both policy influenced Malaysian artists' works either directly or indirectly under the selected themes. The Malay Dilemma, social differences and social cohesion will discuss under the themes of national identity as these themes are interwoven to one another. As in Chapter 2, I discussed both policies are indirectly promoting multiculturalism as they promoted Bangsa Malaysia as Malaysian nationhood to build Malaysia as a fully developed and united country, but Malaysia is still facing identity crisis. Therefore, I discussed the term Bangsa Malaysia before analyzing the selected works, as it brought to the search of national identity in the arts. Bangsa Malaysia was proposed as part of Vision 2020 to build Malaysians Malaysia. However, this concept was a rhetoric term as it was not consistent with Malaysians Malaysia introduced early in 1960s, as this concept preserved the positions of the Malays. The issues of Bangsa Malaysia will be explained further under the Malay Dilemma. Under the theme of the search of national identity, I discussed the work named In Search of Faraway Places by Wong Hoi Chong, as his practice is often an indirect exploration of Malaysians' identity. This work is one of the Migrant series, reflected that diverse immigration history is the structure and compositions of the contemporary Malaysian nation. His work depicts the migration experience in the late 20th century, where serialized narrations of the triptych and imply the problem of identity. The passport and identity card, as well as Merdeka poster showing in his work, are the most obvious evidence of identity issue being unsolved since Malaysia's independence. Although Wong did not mention that the Vision 2020 policy was the main source of the influence, it is worth noting that when he mentioned his work were based on the story narrated by the elders to create his migrant series, it was actually an indirect response to the identity issues that have not been dealt with since independence until Mahathir took office. Wong also aware of his ancestors' origins, and it is important to note that identity searching is within the national identity, which Wong took into account. Next, I discussed the rhetoric of Bangsa Malaysia is due to the book written by Mahathir in 1970, as this book was his political declarations to create a new Malay society before the launching of Vision 2020. Therefore, the aim for Vision 2020 is to end the Malay Dilemma, which is rooted in Malay nationalism, and Bangsa Malaysia can be seen as creating the new Malay. In this context, I discussed Tan Zhihao's works named the Malay Dilemma, which is consisted of 12 replicated pages of text, which was taken from chapter 2 of the Malay Dilemma with its chapter title What Went Wrong. It was precisely Tan who used the second chapter of the book to make Malaysians understand that there were loopholes in Mahathir's Malay nationalism. As Mahathir introduced Bangsa Malaysia as part of Vision 2020, his concern was still in the Malay nationalism. Therefore, Tan used the beginning of What Went Wrong and the end of This Is What Went Wrong to satirize Mahathir that he could not see his problem. Besides that, Malay nationalism still exists in the Malay society as One Malaysia continued the idea of Vision 2020. Thus, this led the widening of social differences. In this context, I discussed the work by John Lin, named A Few Malaysias, in response to the Malaysia policy that require consideration to develop from social aspects. Lin invited the audiences to hang their clothing, fabrics, or any materials that are in colors of red or white onto the bottom piece of the triptych to complete the imagery of the Malaysian flag. These actions can be seen as a metaphor in delivering to the audience that those existing policy in the Malaysian society, ignoring the differences, cultural, social, and economic demarcation lines will become unprotected cliques in nature. As a piece of clothing itself is a personal thing, it reflected the materiality and functions as protection of the flag. Essentially, Lin also required the audience to take a simple but emotional stance, dismantling hierarchies and bridging the gap between the flag and the people it presents. The aforementioned issues of national identity, Malay nationalism, and social differences all affected our country's social cohesion, and I point out that the new economic policy privilege granted to Bumiputra were the major challenges Malaysia faced. Therefore, social cohesion needs to be aroused in Malaysia. In this context, I discussed artist E. Yilan's works to evoke the cohesion of Malaysians. This lightbox installation entitled True Real Colors Glasses was pieced together by a series of archive portraits found at Pakat's photo studio from the year of 1977 to 1982. It presented a celebration of a shared history of individuals and groups who chose to document themselves and their lives in Malaysia. This installation and a series of photographs show a generation of human history in Malaysia, despite political and social engineering. In addition, this work's title, True Rose Color Glasses, has its own meaning itself, which was defined as seeing something in a positive way. Therefore, through a nostalgic lens, he pulls us back from negative politics to build cohesion among Malaysians. Although most of the discussion above are the works that responded negatively towards the policy, There are some early works that can be seen as optimistic towards Malaysia policies. The work entitled Pastibole by artist Liu Kongyu depicted his optimistic of Vision 2020, in which the work reflected Malaysia's newly prosperous economic status in the mid-1990s as one of the emerging Asian tiger economies during Mahathir's era. The work was a symbol of Malaysia's economic power and global standing by redesigning it in a collage of 5 photo trophies neatly wrapped in a gift-wrapped glass window. It was placed on a long red carpet to display the KL Tower and Twin Towers on a cabinet as precious monuments and achieved of a modern Malaysia, while having the Vision 2020 logo hung on the wall behind as a symbol depicting Malaysia's progress towards the future. Which can be seen that Liu uses the symbol of monuments to express his optimistic that Malaysia will achieve success through its policies. To conclude, this research examines the responses in the selected works of Malaysian artists towards Malaysia policy, Vision 2020 and One Malaysia. The development of multiculturalism is in relation to Malaysia policy, arts, culture and society as Malaysia experienced the shift of society. This shift affected Malaysia confronted various issues that related to ethnic diversity and addressed it with the policy that were argued in promoting multiculturalism. Therefore, the themes such as national identity, the Malay Dilemma, social differences, social cohesion, and the optimistic responses of policy are selected to discuss in this milieu. This is because the implementations of policy affected Malaysian artists to respond in a more responsive and confrontational model of creativity that aim at solving social problems as response towards policy. That's all about my presentation. Thank you for your listening.